Hello, good evening, namaskara, and welcome to this evening's BIC Streams session. 1,000 Cranes for India, reclaiming plurality amid hatred. In Japan, there is a legend that anyone who folds 1,000 paper cranes will have their wishes realized. But folding cranes and the meditative, solemn care that it involves has come to mean more than just an exercise in wish making. Origami cranes have become a symbol of renewal, atonement, and warning. 1,000 Cranes for India is an anthology that uses the Japanese paper crane as a metaphor to explore some of the fault lines that threaten India: gender, sexuality, caste, class, religion. A few people from the formidable cast of some of India's finest poets, journalists, and storytellers who have contributed to this anthology are here with us. We have Pallavi Iyer, the editor of this anthology, Anjum Hassan, Ranjit Hoskote, Veena Venugopal, in conversation with Indira Chandrasekhar. The bios of all the speakers will appear on the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you'd like to share a comment, an observation, or ask a question at any time through the session, please feel free to use the Q&A box at your disposal next to the chat box. Without holding up the session for too long, I give you Indira Chandrasekhar.
Thank you, Lekha. I hope everybody can hear me and see all of us, and all the technicals are going fine. It's a pleasure to have Pallavi Iyer, editor of the anthology 1,000 Cranes for India, here with us at the BIC platform, with three of the stellar contributors to the book, Anjum Hassan, Ranjit Hoskote, and Veena Venugopal. Sorry about my dog banging at the door, but it's one of the hazards of working from a home office. Yes, Lekha read out part of the blurb, and which says so beautifully, folding cranes and the meditative, solemn care that it involves has come to mean more than just an exercise in wish making. I think all of us will understand what it means to enter that solemn meditative space. Any of us who've played with origami know the need for care and the attention to folding edge to edge, corner to corner. Any of us who've engaged in repetitive practice, be it folding a number of cranes, or 10 minutes of pranayam, or 108 Surya Namaskars, or even 8, will recognize the meditative aspect of repeated practice. But the thing that makes us sit up and be alert is what Pallavi said when publicizing this session. It's about the urgency of reclaiming plurality. That is what this anthology is about. So the way we're going to structure this panel is the following. I'll give a brief response to the anthology, something that I'm going to do through the session. Think of it as the fold lines on an origami paper square appearing again and again as one traverses the plane. I'll begin with this response to the anthology, and then I'll talk to Pallavi, and then with each of the contributors about their work. And is it all right if I move in alphabetical order, Anjum, Ranjit, and then Veena? And then at the end, we'll open to questions from the audience that Lekha has already described to you how you can go about doing. We live in a jaded world, a benumbed world, as Pallavi puts it in her anthology. We are buffeted by multiple and shocking injustices against life and nature. Injustices that we, as good citizens, decent humans, feel we cannot accept, and yet often feel powerless to act against, be it the burning of beasts, of trees, of forests, of people, of spaces, of societal values. So we retreat to safe spaces within ourselves, our families, our communities, and thus in some terrible subterranean way reinforce these injustices. But every now and then our responses are reawakened, and that reawakening builds reaction, defense, resistance, activism, action, as it has here in this anthology. So Pallavi, if I could move to you. You address what prompted the compiling of this anthology in your very finely written introduction. Perhaps you could share some of that with the audience. What triggered this anthology, why you developed it, and perhaps elaborate a little on the Japanese connection. Why a thousand cranes?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Indira, for your sort of thoughtful, indeed textured introduction. And let me say at the outset that I first conceived of this book a while ago. It's almost coming up to 3 years now. It was in April 2018. But because of how long it took to actually get all the contributors together, and then this long delay due to COVID, the book was actually only published towards the end of last year. So it was about 2.5 years from conception to fruition. And yet, and I have to say, I'm kind of devastated by this yet. When it became available, I was flooded with comments about its timeliness. Because when we look at the kind of cleavages that are cutting India into bloody, painful pieces along multiple lines that you mentioned as well, religion, of course, and caste and class and gender and language and diet. I could really go on. The cleavages are not really healing, and in many ways, they are deepening. But to return to the origins of the book, as the question that you posed, I woke up one day in April 2018, and I happened to be in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. I was there on a holiday with my family. And, I woke up and looked at the news on my phone, as I do every morning, and I read of the confinement in a temple, of the gang rape and of the murder of Asifa Banu, who was an 8-year-old girl in Kashmir. And, I think like you mentioned, there are so many atrocities that are kind of in competition with each other for our attention. And in many ways, I had tended to feel that if I couldn't be equally outraged by every brutality, was it almost fair to be outraged by anyone? And yet, it was some kind of, inflection point for me, reading about Asifa Banu. And when I read how she was sedated, violated, bludgeoned, choked, I literally felt like I couldn't move. It was just this kind of dense, heavy weight that seemed to descend on me. And I think more than anything else, I felt very guilty. I somehow felt complicit, contaminated, yeah, it was strange. And we visited the Peace Park Memorial in Hiroshima later that morning. And I didn't speak of Asifa to my husband, obviously to my kids either. The museum itself that I was visiting was dedicated to the victims of the nuclear bombing in 1945. And I found out that estimates put the numbers of those who had been killed in the Hiroshima bombings at between 60,000 and 80,000 people, and that the heat that had been generated by the bombing at the time was so intense that people had simply vanished in the explosion. They had vaporized. And so it was a very sort of solemn experience wandering through it and taking in the different exhibits, which included, I remember one called School Trousers, which was simply a tattered pair of trousers that had belonged to a child called Naoki Mikami, who had been attending morning assembly at the moment of the explosion. So I was going through all of these, and at some point we came upon two very sort of simple childlike paper cranes, origami paper cranes, that were actually part of the exhibits. And there was something so startlingly gentle and defiant, and also powerful about these cranes, that in some ways they seemed to both acknowledge the horror of what had happened to the people in that city, but also simultaneously to reclaim something and to refuse the ugliness of it. These were, of course, not the very first origami cranes that I had seen in Hiroshima, because the entire city was festooned in them. Almost all the facades of restaurants and offices and malls had skeins of cranes hanging from them, because school children folded and sent in millions of these to the city every year. And the origin of this sort of global flight of the paper cranes lay in the story of another little girl, a Japanese girl called Sadoko Sadaki, who had been 2 years old when the 1945 bombing happened. And she survived the bombing, but not for long, because she eventually succumbed to radiation related leukemia. But while she was sick in the hospital, Sadako had desperately folded origami paper cranes in hope of a reprieve, because there was a legend in Japan that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, then your wishes will be granted. So the young girl folded and folded, but her strength gave out. However, her cranes kind of took flight, and her classmates continued to make the paper cranes in support of her. And then this was an idea that took off, not only in Japan, but really around the world. And since then, the crane has emerged as a kind of symbol of apology, of resistance, of healing, something that I really think we need in many parts of the world, but India as well at the moment. So, I felt about the cranes that while they might have emerged out of Japan's particular mythology and history, that there was a resonance to the fact that the crane is a migratory bird and crosses borders as well. And I remember thinking, despite how I had felt that morning, how felled and emptied and sort of stripped of succor and hope I had felt by reading about Asifa that morning, that giving up was really not an option. And that one had to just keep fighting the good fight, as it was, best as you could. And the weapons that I had at my disposal were words and cranes. And so when I returned to Tokyo, I began to post pictures of paper cranes on different kinds of social media platforms, and I made a video asking people to fold cranes as a kind of gesture of defiance, as an act of reclamation. And as to me, as I'm sure to many, I'm sure most of you in India, it's not just a territory, it's an idea. And that idea asserts and celebrates a multiplicity of identities. And like most Indians, I was myself a mongrel, a mishmash, a cocktail of all kinds of things. I was half a Tamilian, half a UPite, a Delhiite, a Hindu culturally, an English speaker, an atheist by choice, a Muslim by heritage, and the identity, that threaded all these multiplicities together was that I was an Indian. And so I put out this appeal to people who felt similarly, saying, make me a crane. And people responded. And I had cranes flying in from Jakarta, Beijing, Tokyo, California, Pune, Hong Kong, you name it, all over the world. And it was at that time that a friend of mine reached out to me and suggested that perhaps we try to do a book around this. And I was wondering how one would do a book around the crane. And then I thought that perhaps we could use it as a motif of connection, and also as a motif of reclamation, so that those of us who worked with words and who fought with words could reach out to each other and kind of form a civic space, and be the best army really that we could be. And I was lucky to find a receptive publisher. I've said this before, but I have to say that the publisher was very serendipitously named as Seagull Books, because how could a seagull refuse a crane, right? And I wrote to friends and acquaintances and total strangers whose work I admired, to ask them to come on board. This was really a labor of love, Indira, with no financial recompense in what are tough times financially for everyone, but
Yes.
in many ways really for writers.
Yeah.
And I was gladdened by a very overwhelmingly positive response. I'd say it took me about a year to sort of corral and collect and edit everyone's contributions, but ultimately we ended up with a very fine a collection of 23 pieces that really encompass reportage, stories, poems, memoir, comedy, polemic. And I think it's really the kind of complex and enriching diversity that India both deserves and demands.
Yeah.
And while most of the pieces were written in English, we did have contributions from poets who write in Kashmiri, Bengali, and Odia. So I did try to make an effort to diversify the book linguistically as well.
Yeah.
And what connects the pieces is the paper crane. And I love the way that it kind of flits from piece to piece, appearing and disappearing. And, in some of the pieces, it's like an Easter egg, almost hidden from sight. And in others, it's up front and center, and important part of a plot point. So yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to be here today and talking also with three of the contributors, Veena, Anjum, Ranjit, I think all of whom have written very different pieces in structure. Veena's is a kind of dark comedy of manners in the age of social media. And I just love what it reveals about, class cleavages. It's instantly recognizable, the whole Mem Sahib servant relationship in an updated version for the new millennium in, hi-fi society in Gurgaon. And Ranjit's essay is almost like a prose poem, given the lyricism of his prose about photojournalists who, he says, map the wages of destruction and the arrears of hope. And also the butterfly effect, wherein small events somewhere have ripple effects everywhere else, and how our present has somehow become militarized, so that we seem to be in this kind of constant war zone. And Anjum's is this absolutely wonderful fictional meditation, I think, on womanhood, on gender, and it takes place in the mind of a commuter on the Delhi metro. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more from them, and indeed your reaction as well, Indira, to these very fine pieces in the book.
Yes, it is really an extraordinary collection. And I think the fact that it's these multiple different forms really does emphasize that sense of plurality as well. I just wanted to draw attention to, while I was reading it, it's a terribly moving experience reading this anthology, moving from poem to essay to fiction to, it's really an extraordinary experience. When I started off, this struck me very much. You say at one point, the crane is a migratory bird. It crosses borders and makes its home with scant regard to the blood-soaked lines that humans have drawn on maps. And then almost in response to that, soon thereafter, I think in the first essay that you have, the second piece in the book, is Salil Tripathi's piece. And this paragraph sort of stood out for me, almost responding to that comment, which is, the last Siberian cranes came to Keoldeo National Park in the winter of 2001, or perhaps 2002, nobody is quite sure. But at some point, as the soft, pale light struggled to cut through the thick smog enveloping the skies over northern India, the birds stopped visiting. Scientists have suggested reasons. I remain struck by the timing when the crane stopped flying to India. For 2002 was the year of a carnage in Gujarat that lasted months. Instead of the white cranes with their black feathers, the skies over Gujarat cities were filled with vultures. Essentially, I mean, you're addressing through this anthology the multiple aspects of plurality that we believed were part of the fabric of our nation. They're written into our hard-won, intellectually profound, thoughtful, collectively created constitution that was formulated by some of the great minds of the nation. And now it's a threatened plurality. We can't take its robustness for granted anymore, right? And so that, I think, is brought home very profoundly by this. I just wanted to address one quick thing, which was, anthologies are amazing because they hold so many different things together. They hold form, or they hold idea, they have commonality, they have literary integrity. And what's interesting about your anthology, which is very much in contrast to an anthology that I just brought together, which is held together by form, is yours is held together by idea. And then you really searched for people who would speak to this idea regardless of form. And that was very interesting. So maybe later on in the conversation, we can address how you actually found these writers, or what it was that made you reach out to them. It could be something interesting to talk about. But before we do that, maybe I can sort of get into talking to some of the contributors to, as I said, in alphabetical order, perhaps. And so, Anjum, may I start with you? Yes. I came upon your love in a Delhi metro. I didn't read in order. At first I did, I read Tishani's poem and then Salil's, and then I sort of went forward and then backward and then came to love on the Delhi metro. And I have to say, it reinforced to me why I love fiction. It's why I love the short story. And the power of fiction in opening the mind of a reader. I was absorbed, I was living with the narrator, I was, with the main character. It's an extraordinarily fine piece, Anjum. So kudos. It's really beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the story is set in, for those in the audience, the story, as Pallavi's already elaborated, is set in the ladies' compartment of a Delhi metro. And obviously you wrote it from the experience of traveling on the metro. And it's such a masterpiece of observation. I mean, really it is. Every person you look at in the compartment suddenly comes alive with their story. And you have these multiple characters, multiple lives. And so it's the plural in plurality somehow by looking at that. And I love the first one with the missing toe. Would you like to talk a little bit about the experience of sitting in the metro?
Yeah. Responded to the piece as fiction, because it's a bit of a mix, I think, but it could be read either way. There are points, I think, when it becomes a bit, like Pallavi said, a meditation. And so I think I was seeing it as a cross between a story and an essay. But I like the idea of fiction, and this is true also of the pieces that I've written in my previous collection of stories, A Day in the Life, to be sort of the form to be capacious enough to include things that are not necessarily straightforwardly, X happened and Y happened, but also there is space to reflect and observe and meditate within the confines of what we call a short story. So it is very much drawing on the observations of being a commuter on the Delhi metro, women's compartment in particular, and it is written in the first person. And I think the starting point for me, well, there were two things. One was doubt about this category of woman, about gender on the whole.
Yes.
Because I'm not a sociologist. I'm a writer of fiction, and my fiction, I would like to believe, is open-ended and is not forcing conclusions about anything, as raising more questions than it answers. So if that's your position as a writer of fiction, then how do you deal with a sometimes exclusive category like gender, a category that can sometimes be limiting and exclusive? And I don't usually write or even use the term gender or woman in that way in my work. So I thought the Delhi Metro women's compartment could be an interesting stage, sort of, where in a way gender is enforced because you are only with women, but it's also performed, I thought, in an interesting way, because you're looking at other women constantly. And sometimes Delhi being Delhi, these journeys can be quite long. So I was just fascinated by the variety of women that one travels with. And there are obviously differences of class. There are differences of dress, and dress is a big interest, and shoes is a big interest. So I think what I wanted to do is going back to the theme of the anthology, which is one of the themes, which is violence, gender violence. How do I draw out my concerns about that without reaching any kind of moral about it, but just through observing these very different kinds of women? So I think I begin in doubt and end in doubt, and it's the whole yellow line, so it's a long journey, but one hopes that the poetry of the encounter, the everydayness of the observation, is elevating in itself. And I think that's the best that one can hope for with literature in general, when one is talking about the kind of issues that Pallavi has raised.
Yes.
I mean, it's unlikely that we're going to save lives. I'm not even sure if we're going to save ourselves entirely. And I'll end with a line in Pallavi's introduction that really struck me, which of course I read retrospectively. I didn't have it before me when I was writing this piece. But she says, there is in India injustice in just being alive. But if you are to be alive to injustice, then it's very hard to live. You know, so this conundrum, I think, really goes to the heart of the anthology. And I think the only way perhaps to deal with it for a writer is to try and get closer to life.
Yes.
In some way.
Yes.
And that's what I was trying to do with this piece.
Yes, because the way you weave the main character into the story very gently, because she is an observer in the ladies' compartment, she's reconstructing other people's lives, which is in itself a huge form of recognizing plurality. And then slowly she enters the story. She's not drawing attention away from what's happening in the compartment. And then there's another form of plurality through gender that enters. It's really very, very clever and elegant and fine, Anjum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Would you like to read a little bit from this story?
Should I read right now
Yes.
a little bit, just like a couple of minutes? I think is what.
Yes. I mean, just to.
Yeah. So I'll just read from the beginning to give a flavor of the language and the idea. So, love on the Delhi metro. I happened to glance down and notice the big toe on her left foot is missing, a muted stump instead. Darling, what have you done to yourself? She has that color in her cheeks that comes from milk-fed prosperity, everlasting youth, self-absorbed happiness. The whole time that she stands there by the door and I stand there facing her, I'm secretly cataloging her beauty. The shimmer of her hair, the shine of her watch strap, the gloss of her lips, the glow of her eyes, the opalescent earrings. I love this about women, that left to themselves, they become themselves and see nothing but themselves. Not just those who look into the flattering camera eye of their phones. Not just those who study their reflections when the glass is darkened by the train's passage through tunnels, but all of them, all of us. Yet all of us have this too, the missing toe, or some piece of our hearts that's mutilated, some prized and secret deformity or ghastly visible scar. We are each straining towards something, a healing or a completion, a correction, a realignment. The world is a difficult home for us. We build our half-secure rooms in it and fill them with all the comfort we can gather, but it's not ever enough. There's always the voice calling from outside the window, the fist banging on the door. And then the train pulls into Model Town, milkmaid gets off, a thick-set man finds himself in this all-women compartment, looks mildly confused, is reminded of his gender, looks shocked, hurls himself out through the doors just as they are closing and stands there on the platform, forlorn. A wave of women has swarmed out, a wave of women swarm in, and a new perfume fills our locked female box. A new combination of skin and sweat, almost empty lunchboxes, and still drying shampooed hair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anjum. Thank you. I love that you can write it in a way that engages us so much and yet have so much seriousness and so much importance to consider from it through reading it. So thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Pallavi, for bringing this story in. Ranjit, I move to you next. Traveling in the zone, the image in an age of butterfly effects and haywire bombs. What a beautiful opening paragraph to your essay, Ranjit. It is just a masterly description of the stalker and the bleak, terrifying zone of extinction that holds so much fascination in Tarkovsky's The Stalker. And then you go straight to, today our normality has been engulfed by the devastation of war, massacre, tyranny, and famine. Our lives are dominated by violence and shaped by surveillance. We pass checkpoints without even realizing it. Cell phone companies, rather than watchtower patrols, tell us where we have crossed borders. And some borders cannot be passed. They have been lost to clouds rising from explosions buried under a rain of shrapnel and debris. Cataclysm is everywhere. Wherever we go, we are traveling in the zone. So I don't know how many people in the audience have seen The Stalker, but it is truly a chilling, chilling place to be in this film. And now that you bring this into our everyday reality, that is terrifying, Ranjit. So among the many cultural hats you wear, writer, poet, cultural theorist, you write about art, forms of art. And so your piece naturally is rooted in art, in film in this case, and photography. For The Stalker, that taciturn, demon-driven man, as you call him, from the film, who maps that bleakest of bleak spaces, is the photojournalist. So what led you to this idea?
Thank you so much, Indira. Let me first say what a privilege it is to be part of this anthology and to have been able to respond to Pallavi's invitation to reflect on some of these circumstances which are really not external to us in any way. It's not as if there's a fulcrum point from which we can comment on these things, because we live these conditions, they become part of our fundamental constitution. So for me, this essay was also a way of thinking about what it means to participate in such situations, and also to be able to observe and bear witness to them in some way. And I've, for the longest time, been preoccupied with photojournalism, with also the point at which a certain kind of journalistic practice then becomes art, if you will. How does it produce memorable images? And I think we tend to forget that a lot of iconic art, and some people use this rather questionable term, art photography. When you think about it, a lot of it was absolutely in the heat of the observed moment. It appeared in the first place in newspapers and magazines. I'm thinking of Robert Capa, thinking of David Goldblatt's work in South Africa, for instance. So that's always been a point of fascination. So that's one of the things I wanted to think about. Photojournalism, how it produces images of a society or a world which always seems to be at the brink of some kind of catastrophe, some profound disintegration, and where that sort of train of reflection might take us. And as for Tarkovsky, he is and always will be one of my favorite filmmakers. So the zone, I think, is an incredible metaphor. And I think I belong to a generation that grew up watching Tarkovsky, and then Chernobyl happened at some point, almost as if, that was the zone achieved. It was absolutely uncanny. And then it's, whether it's Fukushima, wherever you look, wherever you turn, it's the zone is an extremely persuasive and terrifying metaphor of how we lead our global collective lives.
But yes, thank you for that. And so what in a way you bring to the fore also is this, the stalker in Tarkovsky is a guide. As you say already in your essay, he's also somehow, he's also compelled to stay in the zone, compelled to be part of the zone. He cannot, he is as fascinated by it as everyone else who's reaching out to be there. There's no option for him, there's no choice. And so when you draw the idea of the photojournalist into this, I think what struck me is how much they have to balance that. There's that equilibrium between their, well, I hate to use the word morality, but in a way their moral compunction to act, to be activists and to be observers, to be documenters, to be participants. Could you comment on that? Because you draw that out very beautifully in your essay.
Well, thank you, Indira. I think it's an incredible pressure under which the photojournalists, but also many of us who have other entry points into reality, we all have that pressure that's operative on us, including in what Anjum and Pallavi have just said. On the one hand, it could be social reportage, it could be political commentary, it could be something as extreme and dramatic as going into a war zone. But the point is that, sooner or later, you will turn into a partisan. So the idea of having some kind of Olympian, objective account of what is unfolding is almost impossible. So a thread in my essay also has to do with this sort of pressure. What does it mean to be a moral subject? What side are you on? You can't pretend to be a neutral observer. And I think that's going to become ever more urgent for all of us, because this is what I imply in the essay. The zone is not now a place that you go to as an exceptional place. It is, we are all in the zone. And in very, very particular ways, not only metaphorically. And we see this unfolding right now as we speak. We see it at the borders of Delhi. What happens to empires is that the techniques of oppression and repression that they begin to develop and refine in their outlying areas, colonies, protectorates, all this has a nasty way of coming back to the center. It's what's happened to the US, it's what happened to the USSR, and it is what is happening here. So this concern that I have, which also informs the essay, with the militarization of everyday life, that springs actually for me from a very particular personal circumstance. Over the generations, many members of my family have gone into the armed forces. They've served with distinction in the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, also the Marine Corps during the early phase of the Sri Lanka operations. So when I speak about the military, I don't speak from some uninformed perspective that either foolishly glorifies the military or has some knee-jerk allergy to them. I've seen what it means. I grew up as a child. Some of the first words that I remember are, forward positions, non-family posts, insurgency. These are among the earliest phrases in my vocabulary. So I know what this means. I've seen it at close quarters. And I'm not disposed either to be allergic to it or to glorify it, but just to point out that there is a danger with turning military operations into some kind of cult. And what is happening today in our country and in many other countries is precisely this. Military solutions become a metaphor and a template for how you deal with civil life. So this is something else that I really wanted to dwell on. That to me is a particular ground for the production of hatred, for the production of the other, and for seeking solutions that do not conduce to any kind of healthy collective life.
Indira, you are muted.
Which I did not do myself, I don't think. But anyway, would you like to read, Ranjit? Would this be a good moment?
Sure, sure.
Thank you.
I'm going to read maybe precisely something. Frankly, I could have read this instead of saying my piece.
Glad you said it. Thank you. Thank you. No, I think it's terribly important to be said. The air show is on today in Bangalore. We're lucky that we don't have planes flying overhead.
Right.
And, yeah, so it's necessary to be said. Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
It goes like this.
Mm-hmm.
Our vocabulary has become warlike, even in peacetime. We talk of mission objectives and task forces, even when the furthest we get to the theater of war is a cricket ground decked with rival colors or a discreetly paneled boardroom. We talk of buffer zones and safe passages, even in civic discourse concerning sanitation and transport problems. Even the pictures on the sports pages, with goalkeepers crashing in slow motion, hockey sticks raised in salute, athletes gnashing their teeth, and players punching the air, have begun to resemble battlefield images. Television anchors get into flak jackets and strut around their studios, playing out childhood fantasies of being field commanders. All life has become militarized. We are would-be combatants in act and phrase, and this may not be unusual in an epoch when large swaths of the world's land surface are subjected to the strictest controls in the name of martial emergency. And I'm going to skip to another para. I think specifically of how my ancestral homeland, Kashmir, is presented through the images of photojournalism today. At their best, these images evoke pity and terror, the classical conditions of tragedy, and force us to ask questions. What is it like to live daily in the shadow of heavy artillery, your identity questioned at every street corner? What is it like to conduct the music of commerce to a score written for a symphony of bazookas and bombs, an orchestra of tanks and snipers? What can childhood mean when its games are played on hillsides planted not with fruit trees, but with minds? How do individuals cope with a reality that unfolds in the form of bullet-pocked walls and broken windows? Who are these sturdy yet vulnerable figures? This woman walking through a graveyard overcrowded with headstones, this old woman praying under the bayonet, this girl cowering as soldiers ransack her home in search of hidden insurgents.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranjit.
Thank you.
Veena, we shall move to you. Well, how interesting. We return to fiction and unexpected symmetry imposed by the alphabet. So Veena, we move to you, to a story which, as Pallavi pointed out, brings to the fore the ambiguities, the difficulties, the injustices of part of our daily middle class life. That is the relationship that you bear with the staff in your house, the maid, the driver, the servant, as they're called. And it's a very extraordinarily cleverly written story because you have this young middle-class woman, you assume she's young, she's striving to be somebody in her social group, and her social group is now mediated by social media, by public presence in an online world. And you sympathize with her even as she lives with such duplicity with her maid. Would you like to tell us a little bit about, this? Tell us about your story.
Yes, so the story essentially is about, like you said, a young mother, a middle-class woman who lives in a building like I do in Gurgaon, which is, cosmopolitan. Everyone here is from somewhere else. So that means that all our rules are new and all the rules are laid by us. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the sort of the dominant conversation is in all of these sort of new groups with new rules is about how do we deploy this new power that we have. Mm-hmm. I have been sort of really fascinated by the relationship between employers and maids for the last few years, and I've been sort of hyper vigilant and very and tend to observe sort of how this has been playing out, especially because even for someone like me, I wasn't sort of raised in a home which had full-time help, but because of liberalization and sort of the excesses of economic sort of favors the education and so on and so forth. So I do have a full-time help, and therefore I'm making up these rules as I go along. And what happens in households like ours, in households like the ones that we're surrounded by, is this sort of everyday violence of callousness. Because if you start to sort of analyze every interaction that you have with people that you employ, you are not, that is not a viable situation. So callousness and sort of turning a blind eye to how you come across on the other side is a necessary part of sort of sustaining this very unequal relationship that the employer has with the maid. And why this is different from an employer and an employee situation in an office is because this plays out in your home, and where you are at your rawest self, where you tend to shed all pretenses that you are so exhausted from keeping up outside, and they see you in your very raw, ugly form. And because they are so inconsequential in terms of what their impression of you is, you don't even bother to sort of hide that. So it's a very true, it's a very raw, and it's a very unequal relationship. And I'm always amused when I hear people around say that, oh, I treat my maid like a part of my family, and she is family to me. And it's very amusing because I've never heard a maid say that of the employer, that they are family to me. I mean, that's a much rarer situation than the other way around. So that was the first set piece that I had, and then the second one was this extremely online life that that all of us tend to live. I especially tend to, and 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 where we sort of try to curate for ourselves this person that we perhaps are not. So here, so therefore, I thought it's an interesting sort of idea to bring, who you are really, and compare and contrast it to who you think you want the world to see you as. And therefore, the story is about this lady who has a maid, and because of a bizarre set of circumstances, or as things actually happen to do these days, that like the most sort of inane things go viral. The maid goes viral, and the employer sort of tends to try to benefit from it, and to sort of take advantage of it and use the maid as a set piece, as it were, in making herself a success amongst the large group of people who she wants to impress online. So I just saw that it sort of was an interesting inequality to look at when Pallavi, wrote to me about the anthology and what she hoped to accomplish with it.
Yes. Very, I mean, your writing is so vibrant. There's a great vibrancy in the piece. And maybe it would be nice to read something as well, to give people a sense also of the piece, which is so clever, and also of the range which is in the anthology. I think this is so interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Indira.
Yeah.
So I'll read a little bit from the beginning, and then I will leave it to interested listeners if they want to sort of read the rest of it in the book. The story is called The Maid. It all started with the oversized glasses her son had found downstairs, bright blue with an exaggerated cat's eye that ended in golden tips. She had asked him to throw them away, but when Sonia Sarm opened her drawer full of sunglasses the following afternoon, there it was, the servant. She must have put them there. Millie, Millie, idhar aao, she yelled. Millie appeared, a broom in one hand, wiping her forehead with the other. Why have you kept this here? Sonia snapped. Millie stepped forward to see the offending item. It was on the table, Didi, so I thought it was yours, she said. Sonia rolled her eyes. Really? How could Millie ever think she would wear something as garish as this? It's garbage. Rishi picked it up from somewhere. Throw it away, she said. Millie took it and walked away. A minute later, when Sonia followed her into the kitchen, she found her standing there, the glasses on her face, trying to glimpse a reflection on the polished surface of the cupboards. She looked ridiculous, like a dog on a skateboard. Hold it, Sonia said. She came back with her phone, turned Millie to the light, and quickly took a picture. Back in the living room, Sonia labored over the caption. My servant's idea of coolness, she typed. In the ladies' Facebook group that she was a part of, there had lately been some policing of language. She remembered someone being shredded apart in the comments for referring to her servant. So what should she say instead? Maid? She Googled. Is maid okay for servant? But the results weren't relevant to her research. This was too much work for the phone. She opened her laptop and after a long search found the offending post on the group that had led to the dissection of the semantics of the word servant. Maid, it seemed, was okay, but not ideal. Household help was more acceptable, but to Sonia it seemed to lack a spark, more like a term from a government file. Finally, she returned to her phone and uploaded the photo. My home manager, she wrote, expecting a few laughs at the exaggeration of the job title, as well as the glasses Millie was wearing. The likes started pouring in almost immediately. The group had some 6,000 members, so anything less than 100 likes indicated the post had fallen flat. Sonia watched as the number crawled up. After 10 minutes or so, the first comments rolled in. She really looks cool with them. And then that comment started getting liked. This Sonia hadn't expected. Agree, someone said. I like the way she's not smiling in the picture. Almost looks like Meryl Streep from The Devil Wears Prada. Sonia struggled to figure out what was going on. Were they joking or was all of this serious? She waited an hour. Millie finished her work and left. Another hour later, Rishi came home from school. Later, Millie returned to knead the dough and make chapatis for dinner. And all this while, the likes and the comments grew. They seemed to hail Millie as some kind of fashion icon. By about 11, when the family had gone to bed, Sonia read through the messages again, carefully passing them for sarcasm. She couldn't find any. She took a deep breath and then finally wrote, when I saw these glasses at the store, I knew they would be perfect for my Millie. Even though they were branded and quite expensive, I decided to buy them as a gift for her. We are both thrilled. With a quivering thumb, she pressed the button that said post. The next morning, the post had garnered over 800 likes. Her comment was liked by 357 people. A string of praises called her a marvelous employer, a good person. The hashtag stay blessed appeared more than 100 times. I will leave it at that.
Oh, it's so profoundly exploitative, and yet you can't hate Millie either somehow. He seems so desperate and, needs this. Yeah, Pallavi, I think all our others are muted. So I'll wait for yes. Pallavi, I was just curious. I mean, how did you go about finding who would be part of this anthology? I mean, it's such an extraordinary collection. And then also in the meantime, Anjum, Ranjit, Veena, if you want to respond to each other's work or have something to say, please just jump in, raise your hands and jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was essentially and reaching out to writers whose work I had come across and admired in different groups, as simple as that.
Nice.
And who I hoped would respond to the premise of the book as well.
Yeah.
It was difficult for me in some ways because I'm kind of removed a little bit, I was in Japan at the time and I've been wandering the world for the last 20 years. So, I'm kind of always a bit of an outsider wherever I am. And, the same goes for the sort of Indian writing scene. But I think that was helpful in some ways because I was quite neutral in who I reached out to. It was people whose work I enjoyed in different forms. And you had mentioned earlier, Indira, about how anthologies work in different ways and how you have certain anthologies that are very much tied together by form, and this one was more held together by an idea. And I think that was very intentional because, as I said at the beginning, I think that kind of mirrors the whole concept of how I see India as a multiplicity that is held together by an idea rather than one particular type of form. I believe that we come in many different forms, in many shapes and sizes, and many tenors and many textures, and which is what I wanted to bring to the book as well. And what I enjoyed about a lot of the pieces that ended up making it into the book, including all three that we have discussed today, was how many of them, were also sort of shape-shifting and almost genre bending. I mean, we had Veena's, for example, which we just talked about, which was sort of social satire. It was fiction, but it was at the same time very realistic. I mean, if you have been part of any of the social media groups, mom parenting groups, as I have been, it could literally have been just observation. It was so acute. And Ranjit's is always somewhere between poem and prose and art criticism and social commentary and memoir. And Anjum's was, I think, almost sort of deliberately destabilizing in form. It was a narrative. It was, not a strict narrative. It wasn't particularly plot driven. And there were points where you wondered whether it was her writing this, whether she was the person who was on the metro, whether it was a fictional character. So I really loved that about all of the contributions and how they came together in the book. Originally, I had wanted to expand it even further to include more graphic elements. I had wanted to bring in the work of certain graphic artists and photographers, but we had limitations on the publishing side as well. So
aren't we all familiar with that?
Yeah, we did what we could. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Much as I love Seagull, and I think they're so wonderful, but yes, this is the reality. Yes. I, open up to the three of you contributors if you wanted to say something or respond to any of the other pieces, not necessarily even your co-panelists' pieces in the book. Anjum, I see you're unmuted.
Yes, that's a sign, I think,
Yeah.
that I'm thinking. But can you hear me? It says the bandwidth is low, so you're all a bit frozen, but can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that's good, that's good. Yeah, I think I was taken with what I saw as a thread running through many of the pieces, which is this idea of empathy. And I think even the image of the cranes, making the cranes, is very much about empathy. Ranjit, your piece ends with this image of reaching out and redemption, perhaps through empathy. I thought Veena's piece was very interestingly about the commercialization, if one can call it that, of empathy, where it's reduced to sort of hashtags and social media connections rather than real ones. So yeah, I one of the pieces I think that spoke to me very, very strongly, perhaps the strongest to me piece in the book in some ways, in a personal way, was Jonathan Gill Harris's.
Absolutely, for me too.
Yeah, I found that very difficult to read actually, and very, very moving. Partly because he's telling the story of his own family, of his mother's childhood disrupted by the Nazis. She grew up in Poland, was shunted around, and about how she dealt with having come out of that past by folding away, suppressing a lot of that very bitter, very dark history. And he has this wonderful point at the end that sometimes folding a crane is an act of empathy, but sometimes, on the other hand, we also need to unfold the crane to see what we are hiding, what we are hiding when we are doing that folding. And so I wanted to turn it around and ask, how effective is empathy? And sometimes can empathy be too easy because we reach for the easy gesture, and it's easier and easier now in a way to be empathetic in one sense, in the way that Veena describes in her story. You just, say, great, you're a great employer.
I like you. I like you.
Yeah, so the ease of being empathetic versus how easy is it for us to acknowledge our own complicity. And Jonathan Gill Harris has another paragraph towards the end of the piece where he says there's this horrifying image of a child who is killed by the Nazis before his older relatives are carted away to the concentration camps, and he asks, why did the neighbors not speak out? Why did the Polish and the German neighbors of that Jewish family not say anything? And he doesn't stop at that. He goes into the possible reasons for their silence, and one is actually pleasure. The pleasure that we can take in seeing violence done to those who are not us. And we can't pretend that that sort of human reaction to violence doesn't exist.
Absolutely. You see it in schools, for example, when children gang up against another child at a very sort of fundamental and simplistic level, and then that just carries through. No, thank you.
I
Sorry.
just want to add to what Anjum said and sort of, expand it to one point, which is that what is easy now is the performance of empathy,
Exactly.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
and we are all sort of active participants in the performance of empathy. But if you were to sort of act on empathy, then it gets really complicated. And so again, to sort of bring it back to our social lives, it is so easy now to just sort of click a button and contribute to some stranger's child's surgery because you've been fed an ad saying that this person, and then you feel so good about yourself. And it is sort of this easy clinical performance of empathy because you feel like you've done something. It did not take it did not take your time, and it did not take a part of your brain, or it did not take much effort from you, and yet you can sort of then put up a badge saying that I'm an empathetic person. So I think what we have to be wary about now is that we are all sort of participants in this performance of empathy and not really in the action of empathy.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Veena. I was going to make a very similar point, and it also speaks to another aspect of your story, Veena, which is just the distorting effect of social media on our lives today. Because I think that social media both makes it easier to perform empathy, and therefore, kind of to Anjum's point about how it's easy to be empathetic today. But at the same time, it actually makes it harder to be genuinely empathetic because we kind of get stuck into certain silos and into very narrow echo chambers. So I think there is very much a connection between what's happening to empathy today and the distorting effects of social media on the world.
Yes. Ranjit, did you want to contribute in some way?
No, I just to agree that it's true that there's this kind of economy of compassion which comes rather easily and is not meaningful. But also because you're not called upon to transform yourself in any substantial way if you're going to participate in this kind of social media circus of things. Just something I wanted to say, which I meant to say earlier when we were speaking. When Pallavi's invitation came in, it took me back to something that's been with me since I was about 7 or 8 years old. When a cousin told me about Sri Ramakrishna's first epiphany. Which is when he was 6 years old. He falls down in the field and he sees this incredible flight of white cranes against a monsoon sky. It seems to completely transcend time, space, identity. And originally, I thought I might have written something around Sri Ramakrishna's experiences in pluralism. He went through a phase in his life when he experimented with his own being. Entering the space of Islam, of Christianity, of Tantra, various options of, I'm not saying options in a loose way, because he really fully gave himself to each one of those beliefs and practices. And what might that mean? Eventually that went something else that I wrote. But for me, that would be, that would have a more real meaning. How do you cross these lines, which are essentialist? They're laid down for us, they're imposed. The identities that we're ordered to inhabit, how do we transcend those boundaries? I think those are questions which really call upon these reserves of empathy. It's far away from the world of clickbait and so forth.
So something I'd like to maybe get a reaction to from all of you is, what do you think, how powerful do you think what we do as writers, how powerful words are in affecting any kind of change? I mean, I've gone on about fighting with words, and we all know phrases like the pen is mightier than the sword, but do these just betray our own myopic prejudices as writers? Are we like an insignificant elite that's sort of puffed up on its own importance and blind to its impotence ultimately? Like, if you want to fight for an India where pluralism is part of the national metaphysics, is something like what we have done, create a book like this, and we all write in different capacities, and in some ways I feel this is what we do, but how important do you think endeavors like this are to actually create the kind of empathy that we've been talking about?
Well, if I can answer that, try to answer that, Pallavi.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about what Ranjit called the economy of compassion in relation to something like social media that makes it so, can make it so superficial and so easy. But I was thinking exactly that. What about writing? What about art? What about photography? What about the so-called deeper ways of responding? Uh, and I think those can also be jaded. We can also as easily fall into um, the trap of rehashing or repeating what has been said so many times in that same way that it doesn't necessarily mean very much anymore. And so there's an ease in that also. There's an ease, I think, now in being a liberal and talking in a particular sort of liberal way about these issues. That's not necessarily an act of resistance. It could be just an act of echoing. And one is aware that it's very difficult to break out of those patterns. So I think, at least for me, the challenge is, and I'd like to believe that fiction allows for this, or poetry allows for this more than the reported, the more than reportage or polemic, is that you try and make people uncomfortable. Even those who hold on to the liberal pieties, you don't necessarily take the liberal pieties for granted either. Of course, you know which side you're on and you know which side you're speaking from. But is there a way that language can rattle even the accepted good side? And to me, that's always the challenge. And I think many pieces do ask that question. I think Natasha Badwar's piece is a great piece to end with, because it's so much about her own discomfort in trying to write about what's going on in India, and her sense of the impossible. You know, so I think that's very important, that we realize that how hard it is actually to say anything that's effective or half effective, anything that will actually get across to people or make even an iota of difference. And you see, she's not just writing the essay, she's talking about the difficulty of writing the essay. And that to me was very, very honest, actually.
We did a panel together around the book a couple of months ago, and she was saying that the emails that she and I exchanged over the course of a year and a half could have made a book on their own. Hers was the last contribution to come in because she really struggled with the piece. She struggled with it emotionally and experienced a lot of discomfort with herself and with writing it. And so I kind of talked her through it over a period of several months. And yeah, indeed, it was very interesting.
I think silence is an interesting thing to explore as well, because again, that's a concept that comes up in some of the pieces. And
yeah, I think there's a piece called Silence of the Crane or something.
Silence of the Cranes, and Radhika Jha's piece talks about silence.
Oh yeah, that's her piece, Radhika Jha, the Silence of the
But
Crane.
again, there's two sides to silence, I think, because there's this idea of silence in the sense of complicity and not raising your voice, and silence is toxic, but also silence is dignified, I think, sometimes when you realize that you actually, you run out of words. So that was interesting to me, how you can read silence in different ways.
Yes, and silence is fear. It's not often out of complicity, deliberate, but fear. Yes, I mean, I think it's such a privilege in a way to have been able to work, when you described the way in which you worked with Natasha over the piece, what a privilege in a way to have worked with the writers to develop the piece for the book. It's really something rather special. Yes, there's that complacence that you kind of are questioning too, because sometimes you write something and you think, well, I've done my bit. It's echoing very much what you all said already. But I think that complacence can also be, one has to make a conscious effort to examine that complacence all the time. And I think that's one way of addressing, one's moral complicity, I suppose, in not doing something. In not acting. Yes.
Indira, since we have, I think, maybe 5 minutes left, would it be all right if I think one of the contributors could choose and read out a poem, because we have poetry is a major part of the book, and
What a lovely
we
idea.
don't have any of the poets as part of this panel. So I'd love it if anyone would volunteer to read out a poem that spoke to them from the.
Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Thank you for that, Pallavi. I did think, that the poets did recognize that the poets were not here. So, yes.
I don't know if there are any volunteers.
I'm sure there are. I'm
Can
sure
I?
there are. I can see both Ranjit and Anjum looking at their books and Veena's.
Yes, I saw them too, and I was like, okay, it's between them now.
Anjum, do you want to go first?
Sure. I could read, since we were talking about empathy, maybe Tabish Khair's poem, which is a ghazal, and ends again with an image of empathy.
Yes.
It's called Folded Paper. On roiled and churned up earth, the metallic crane stands, a post-historic dinosaur that man commands. Another building rises, skyscraper or mall. This crane invests the concrete forests of the land. Around the corner, in a shaded, tasteful room, someone puts on the DVD of a rock band that protests crimes which on daily news, with TV muted, come across, of course, as bland. The housewife cranes her neck to taste the cooking dish or overhear her neighbors out on an errand. In this world of windlass, uplift, elevator, of derrick, lever, winch, escalator, and stand, in this world of exalting, hoisting, prick up, jack, of set up, way up, perk up, and their 100 brands, when human lives are paper, so easily pulped, and truth or meaning is nothing but a samand, where homicide, murder, rape are reasoned away, and all emotions are, no, not destroyed, but canned. In such a world, what use this piece of blank paper, which I fold into crane and pass unto your hand? O daughter, son, what use except this that you too will fold it for a child, and folding understand only the smallest gesture and the gentlest act redeem our lives against the falling of the sand.
Thank you.
That was lovely.
Yes.
I'm going to read Korkun, which in Kashmiri means which way. It's written by Muhammad Muneem, who many of you will know as the founder of Alif, the band, which also has quite a presence, quite an incredible presence in the way in which it's brought the Kashmiri language out to a larger audience through music. Thinking of works like the Way Home and Jahlamas, and it's translated by, I take this to be a pseudonym, Rumuz-e Khudi, which is actually the name of one of Muhammad Iqbal's books. It simply means secrets of unselving. So here goes Korkun by Muhammad Muneem. I asked the middle, which way? I am drowning to the left and right. Which way? The darkness is seeking me on every street. I would grope for the sun, but which way? When my death clock strikes, they will look for me, but I am already lost and don't know which way. I may be no scholar, but with fire I let my blood burn my being. I shrug off their taunts, but which way? The white paper crane asked me, who are you? What is a leaf? I replied, I am the artisan of every thought. Which way?
No, that's gorgeous. And Muneem actually joined us on a panel about a month ago and read out the poem in Kashmiri. It was beautiful. It sounded absolutely stunning. And he's also promised to set it to music and make it into a song for Alif. So we're looking forward to that.
That's wonderful.
Fantastic. Well, I am going to That was wonderful. Thank you for suggesting that, Pallavi. I don't think many people have responded with questions as far as I can tell. So I am going to suggest that we, unless we'd like to chat some more, to sort of slowly wind down and bring this to a close. Pallavi, would you like to say anything before we close about the anthology, just to bring it together again?
I mean, nothing too much more than what we've already discussed. It's, I'm just very happy that we were able to put this together and, sort of release it into the world. And here's hoping that our cranes fly and they take off, and that other people are able to get hold of the book and read it and, just perhaps think. It's really a provocation to thought. And that's my hope for the book. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd like to thank you, Indira, for a really wonderful job getting all of us to open up on this panel, and of course to the Bangalore International Center for giving us the platform.
Thank you. So I would just like to close by actually, oddly enough, two of the questions that came up were two of the things that I was thinking about closing with this wonderful panel. And one is actually a line from Ranjit's essay, which Anjum referred to already, which is where you close with the idea of empathy. And so you're talking about the photojournalist, and you say, and yet, is it too late or too dangerous for the picturing self to reach out to the pictured other in a gesture of empathy? I mean, that's such a fine, beautiful line to carry back with one. And then I was thinking about this whole idea, actually, Pallavi, the one you raised, of what is the purpose, or what is the role of art? How does art actually act as a form of resistance? And I quote from Chomsky, an oft-quoted essay. I know it's 1967, written in response to the Vietnam War, but always so tremendously relevant, and of course in a sort of little subversive form of resistance in itself. Chomsky's essay is of course available for free on his website, which I think is quite wonderful. And he says, resistance is in part a moral responsibility, in part a tactic to affect government policy. It's a moral responsibility that cannot be shirked. And so you ask yourself, is it unrealistic to imagine? I've closed the quote with Chomsky, and I'm saying, I ask myself, is it unrealistic to imagine that bold yet non-strident forms of resistance make an impact? And I believe that this anthology is contributing to the resistance, is taking a stand for plurality. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to engage with it in this way. Such a pleasure to have you all. Pallavi, thank you very much for being here. Anjum, Ranjit, Veena, just a great pleasure. And Lekha's back, and there is the BIC.
Thank you, Indira.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
All I can say is, what a lovely session. To be bathed in words such as these is truly a privilege, and if I may say, necessary for a reset for those of us stuck in a Zoom purgatory. A sense of that folding of the crane that the title alludes to truly came through. Thank you, Pallavi, Anjum, Veena, Ranjit, for giving us time. And
one last thought, Lekha. I know you're supposed to have the last word. I'm sorry. I'm actually curious about if any of these contributors have folded a paper crane or not. Has anyone done origami cranes? Okay, so Ranjit is a yes. Anjum and Veena?
In their mind.
I haven't.
Bad, Veena, bad, Anjum. So that's your homework for today. YouTube video. Send it to me.
I crochet. I'll crochet you an origami crane.
Okay, good enough. Good enough. Okay.
I think that also they're fiction writers, so they imagine the process.
Good one, Indira. They're forgiven. You're off the hook then.
Thank you, Indira, as always, for being such a lovely moderator. And a reminder, the book is available on, of course, our ubiquitous Amazon.com and hopefully at a bookstore near you. So please.
And directly from the publishers, from Seagull themselves.
Seagull, the website also.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, audiences, for joining us tonight, and see you next time. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.